In this video module, we'll be going over truth values and Boolean tests in Python. Note that from my experience of teaching this several times to undergrad and people who are new to Python, this is particularly challenging for beginners to truly understand what's going on. And that's why I put this video module together so that you can go through it a couple times if necessary. So the material is applicable. If I can figure out how to forward my slides, there we go. Generally, we use this material, we use truth value and Boolean tests to test conditions. We talk about conditions. We can look at the general types of statements that we deal with. We have assignment statements where we have variables and expression. And a couple of examples where this would come into play would be something like x equal 12 or y. And the question is, well, what actually gets assigned, what object gets assigned to the variable x? And the second one that I have here is y equals x or the empty set. From the repetition standpoint, we use conditions all the time to manage looping conditions. So for loop for j is less than x and j is greater than y, we have a series of statements. Similarly, we can use a while loop while x is greater than y and z. So the evaluation structure here is what's of interest. And then what's most commonly used or considered in this context is the selection statements, in particular if statement. So in this one, we have if x is equal to 12, y is equal to y plus 1. So this x equal 12, we understand to be, we're checking to see if x has a value of 12, but the question here is what exactly gets returned as a result of that expression. Similarly, if x is in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, again, what exactly gets returned? Because conceptually we understand that we're doing a logical test, but what's of interest for this module is what specifically gets returned, and then we'll discuss how that is interpreted as a condition test. So the way I structured this module, the first thing we're going to do is talk about some basic rules. So I'm just going to basically read these rules to you, and then we're going to jump into a Jupyter notebook and look at some particular examples. It's important that you go back and forth between the Jupyter notebook and the rules so that you make sure you understand specifically what's been said, or what the conditions are and what the return values are. So the rules are as follows. All objects have an inherent Boolean value of true or false. And so any non-zero number, non-empty object is true. So we think about a set. If a set has any contents, has any values, then it is true value. If it's empty set, it's a false value. Same thing with dictionaries and other structures. Zero numbers, empty objects, special object, none are considered false. And so these are values that are attributed or associated with a particular object, as we'll see. So we have an object, and then there is a truth value associated with that. Comparisons and equality tests are applied recursively to data structures. Recursively means if we have nested data structures, then we recurse into the data structures doing a component by component comparison. Comparisons and equality tests return true or false. So you have an actual true or false value, which are custom versions of just 1 and 0. The Boolean and or operators return an operand object. And this is really a point of confusion that we're going to stress in our Jupyter module, or in the examples that we do in the Jupyter module. Next, Boolean operators stop evaluating what's called short-circuiting as soon as the result is known. And that becomes important in determining the return value, because once you know the result of an outcome, once you know the result of an expression, it simply returns the value. It stops. It doesn't continue the evaluation. Bool.arg is a built-in function that tests the Boolean value. So you can put any expression in this function and you're going to simply get a true or false return that would be equivalent to the Boolean value of that corresponding expression. And then secondly, in terms of the and/ors, x and y is true if both x and y are true. But it's the returned object's value that is true, not the expression itself. So in other words, the expression actually returns an object, as we'll see. In this particular case, it's going to return the object y, assuming y is true. Secondly, x or y is true if either x and y is true. And again, it's the returned object's value, not the actual expression. So the x or y is either one of them is true. And so, for example, if x is true, let's say x has a value of 5, by short-circuiting, the return value will be 5, and x and y won't even get evaluated. The only way y will be evaluated is if x has a 0 value, but then the return value is either going to be x or y. And finally, not x is true. Yes, not x is true if x is false. And the return value here is not an object, but simply a true or false value. So let's jump into the Jupyter notebook that we have here. Here we go. Now let me put it in full screen mode so that we can see. And we see the very first statement that I have is I just have a typical if statement. And so the if statement basically says I'm going to set a value for x. In this case I said range 2. And let's change that to do a simpler one first. Let's just use the number 12. And so what we're testing is if x, then print yep, else print nope. Finally I'm going to print 3 different things. I'm going to print the value of x. I'm going to use bool to return the true or false value, and then I'm going to print the type of x. And so in this case, when we hit enter, with shift enter and execute, you can see that we return yep. So this condition, if x, return true. So as the rule says, if a non-zero value returns true, a non-zero value object has truth value of true, and we see that in the printing, so the result of the if statement, also in the bool condition, and we also see that the type here is integer. So if I were to set x equal to 0 and execute, now we fail the condition, and so you can see that in the value of x, the bool condition, in other words, the Boolean value of that return is false, and then this is also an integer. We can try a string. The string that I have here, ABC, and so it is, of course, true. The value of x is ABC. The truth value of that is true. String. We can also have list, 1, 2, 3. And now, of course, the value of x is our list. It does have a true value. It's of type list. If we put the 0 or the empty list, it fails, and you can see the corresponding values here. And so the important part here is to understand how to interpret the result of this if x for these different values. Now we can put it back to what I had before when we started. So range 2 is true, and it's a type range, and the value is range 0, 2. So that's my simple if condition. Secondly, I have a multi-part condition, and so with this one what we want to do is look at the and and the or statements, and then we want to change the x and y value accordingly. And so we look here and we set a value of x equal 12, y equal 12, and I'm saying if x and y print yep, else print nope. And the thing of interest is showing x and y and then showing this x and y value. Because recall the x and y, if you go back to our rules, x and y is true if both are true, but it's the returned object's value that is true. And back to the original rules, this comparisons, let's see, here it is, Boolean and or operators return a true or false operand object. And that's what we want to illustrate with this condition. So what we expect to happen is x and y right here, x and y are clearly true because they're both true values. So we should print yep. We're going to print x, which is 12. We're going to print y, which is 10. And then the question is what gets printed right here, right? And what should get printed right here is the value of y, because what gets returned from this x and y expression is the value y, the object y, because once y is interpreted, then this expression can be evaluated. Then we can look at the Boolean value of that. And so if we shift enter, and now sure enough we see 12 and 10 and this value of 10 in truth. So now let's take a look at this same thing, but let's switch it to or. And note what happens when we switch this to or. The overall truth value we still expect to be true because this is x or y, so either one of them is true, then the statement will be true. Of course, they're both true. The question is what happens on this x or y? And what we think should happen is we should print x because the or condition can be evaluated as soon as we determine that x is true. So we hit shift enter, and now we see that this x or y value is turns out to be 12 as we expected. So we can go back and look and say, let's change this back to and change this one back to and change this one back to and then let's say, suppose we have y has a value of 0. And now this condition should be false. So we run it, and that's exactly what we see. The Boolean condition is false. We definitely went down the false branch. And in this case, the return value was y, which is false. In order to see that, if I go back in and say, okay, well, let's make this an empty list. Okay, and so now the condition is still false because y has a false value, but a particular question is what gets returned by this x and y value. We know it has a false value, or we suspect it does, and when we run it, we see that the return value is actually the value of y. And so when we interpret this Boolean value of false, but what actually gets returned is the value of the operand. And so it's this what gets returned and interpreting that value that causes people the most trouble, causes people who are new to this the most trouble. It's understanding that return value, not necessarily the interpretation, because it's fairly straightforward to understand what the interpretation is, but it's the actual return value that is a little bit more difficult to understand when you're a beginner. And sort of my final example here, I have a little loop. So I set x equal to 10, and I have a while condition while x is greater than 0. And I'm going to print two things. I'm going to print the x, and then I'm going to print the bool x, which is just the true or false state of x, which we're using to make this statement here. And when I run, we can just say true, 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 and we're going from 10 to 8 to 4, and 10 to 8 to 6 to 4 to 2, because we have this -2 value. So if I did this also, I could just have this simply if x, and I would get the exact same thing, because instead of comparing whether it's greater than 0, while I do while x, it just compares this Boolean value. And so we have the Boolean value true, 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 true. Once x became 0, then the Boolean value became false, which kicks us out of the loop. So in the final section, or the last section of our Jupyter Notebook, we have some examples where we want to try to predict the results of each. And I left you a note here that these questions came from previous exams in my undergraduate Python course. And in these courses, lots of students miss these questions. And so you want to make sure that you understand what's being asked and what the answer is. These are very important concepts for Python programming. So what you should do right now is stop the video, go in with the Jupyter Notebook, and try to make these evaluations, or look and say what is going to be the outcome of each one of these cells when you execute the cell. Then you can start the video back and either listen to my explanation, or since you have the Jupyter Notebook, you can actually see the values as you execute the code. Okay, so the first one we execute and nothing happens because we're just setting up the data. We're setting x equal to 5, y equal to 6, z equal to ABC, and L equal to a list. So the first condition is x is greater than 4 and y is equal to 6. So we're going to look at this, as I've always said, inside out, left to right. So left, there is no inside here. So left to right would be x greater than 4, x is greater than 4, so that would return a true value, and y is equal to 6, which is also true. So because of the and, the return value should be true, the operand in the second case. So shift enter, yes, that value is true. Similarly, we have x is greater than 4 and y is equal to 6. X is less than 4, which of course we know this is false. And so this is going to evaluate to false, and as soon as the interpreter sees and, it knows immediately that the statement is false, and so this is the return value, and we in fact get a get a false. If we switch to the OR value, then either one of these can be true. So x is greater than 4, which is true, or y is equal to 6, which is also true. So this true value will be the return value. And so that's in fact what we see. In this case, we have another AND condition, and we say x is greater than 4, which it is, so this would be true, and z has a value of ABC. And so what we end up with is a true and ABC, and because the expression can't be evaluated until z is determined to not be null. Z is the return value, and we see that the actual return is ABC. Okay, and so most people, a lot of people, the people who miss this anyway, say that what is shown here is true, because they say, yep, x is greater than 4 and z is non-zero, therefore this statement is true. And what they really mean is, or their interpretation is, that the bool value of this is true. And so if I execute that, of course it is. But the actual return value for the statement is not the truth, but the actual object ABC. And so that's the cause of confusion that most people have. For this one, we have x is greater than 4, or, and because x is greater than 4, the expression short circuits right here. And so this object has a value of true, and so that is what gets returned. When we have x is less than 4 or z, then this, of course, is false. So the or evaluation has to continue. And so again, we return the z value, which is, in this case, ABC. And as I did before in 2 cells before, if I were to look at the Boolean value of this expression, it would be true. So let's just do that. If we do bool this and this, of course, that is true, just as we expect. But the critical part here, again, the part that's difficult to understand for newbies, is that the actual object is what gets returned. Then we have the same ones that I had in the video. X and y is 6. X or y is 5, so this is y because it gets the expression gets evaluated when the interpreter evaluates this. This is the value of x because the expression is evaluated when the interpreter hits that. These I basically just threw in as freebies because, again, this was an exam question. Okay, so continuing on, we have x or y, and so x is equal to 5, and so this part is true, and length L. So L is a list with length 4. And so this is essentially true and 4. And so the value that is returned is 4. Then we have that condition. So we already saw that this evaluates to 4. So this inside will evaluate to 4. And Z. So now we will return the value of Z, which is ABC. Then we have just replaced the and with an or. And so the difference here is that the expression can be short-circuited, and this is the return value. So inside here, we have exactly what we had right here, which is 4. So we hit Shift-Enter, and sure enough, we get 4. So once again, you want to make sure that you understand where we're getting these values before you go on. So here we have x or y, x equal y or L, and so this is clearly false. X is 5, y is 6. So this is false or L, and in this case, L is a list, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this internal condition is the list 1, 2, 3, 4, and because we have an or, then we don't even have to evaluate z, and so we end up with 1, 2, 3, 4. And so again, if you look at the Boolean function of this, which is what you would get if you use this in, say, an if statement, the resulting logic would be that this is true, but the actual return value, as I've said, is the list L, the object list L. Oh, it looks like I already did that here, so I'll just do that again. And then finally, we end up with an assignment statement. And so this is kind of a common type of assignment statement where I'm trying to assign a value to z. So I'm saying assign the value 3 and x and y. Okay, and so what it actually gets assigned to the variable z is the question. So 3 is clearly true. So the and continues evaluation. Inside here we have x, which is 5, and y, which is 6. So what gets assigned to z? 6, the value of 6, right? Because the evaluation ends right here. If we replace that with an or, right, then or 3 is clearly true. And as soon as you get to the or, the expression short circuits, and so we should assign the value of 3 to z, which is in fact what we see here. So once again, let me suggest that you pay particularly attention to these rules, the two sets of rules here, and then all of the examples that we did. And when you come across additional examples in the class and in the other video modules where we use if conditions and while conditions and assignments that use ands or ors and so forth, you pay particular attention and always look at those statements and say to yourself, what actually gets returned, right? Not necessarily what the Boolean value is, because that's generally pretty straightforward, but what actually gets returned. And as we progress in the course, we'll use that information further, and so that's why it's imperative that you understand the details.